am 36, not quite young enough to be called a girl, not old enough to accept that all of love's colors must now fade to beige. Comfortable, predictable, and safe. 3 years ago, I buried the man I thought I'd grow old with. Last spring, I married Daniel. He is steady, gentle, thoughtful in the ways that matter. Like how he never forgets to refill the kettle before bed or leaves the porch light on when I'm out late. In him there is no chaos, but sometimes what heals us can also lull us into silence. Daniel has a son from his previous marriage, Eli. He's 21, studying architecture, tall, reserved, the kind of quiet that draws people in rather than pushes them away. We've shared a roof but not much time. Just a few polite dinners, a handful of moments passing in and out of rooms, until Daniel suggested the trip. A few days in the mountains, he said. A chance to reset. It made sense. We were still a patchwork kind of family, stitched together by circumstance, time, and the hope that something real might eventually grow between us. I said yes, not just because it was a good idea, but because I needed to breathe different air. Not the kind that smelled like laundry and leftover coffee, but the kind that lingers between pine trees and cool cabin walls. Quiet, open, uncomplicated. The first day at the cabin unfolded gently. I cooked dinner. Daniel made coffee. Eli helped unload the car, stacked firewood without being asked, and made space for me in the kitchen without ever stepping too close. He was always careful like that, not withdrawn, not cold, just aware. And it was that awareness that caught me off guard. I found myself listening a little too intently when he spoke about one of his design projects. I laughed at a dry comment that wasn't especially funny, and when he handed me a kitchen towel, our fingers brushed, briefly, barely, but something about the moment made me blink. It was nothing, but not quite. That night, while brushing my teeth, I tried to name the feeling. It wasn't attraction, not in the way the world might easily label it. It was something subtler, a recognition, a shift, a softness I hadn't expected. Eli wasn't trying to be anything, and yet, his silence spoke to parts of me I didn't even realize had gone quiet. There was no boundary crossed, but I felt something move in the space between us, a question unspoken, a closeness undefined, the kind that doesn't ask for action, only awareness. That evening, the cabin settled into a familiar hush. Daniel turned in early. He was always like that after a long drive. I stayed behind in the living room, curled into the old couch with a blanket pulled across my knees. A black and white film flickered on the screen, something slow and quiet, the kind where even silence felt deliberate, the kind I've grown to love. There's a comfort in older films, the way they resist hurry, the way characters speak less and feel more. Maybe I was drawn to them because I'd forgotten how to slow down in my own life. Or maybe because I missed the feeling of being held by a moment without the pressure to name it. I didn't hear Eli until he appeared at the doorway, glass of water in hand, mid-step toward somewhere else. Then he paused, looked at the screen. His voice was soft. "You like these kinds of movies?" I nodded. I like the stillness. Everything now feels so fast. This forces me to pay attention. He didn't say much, just gave a slight nod. One of those small gestures that said more than a sentence. Then, instead of continuing down the hallway, he stepped into the room and sat, not beside me but across, an armchair by the fireplace. A safe distance, but for the first time, close enough for the light from the TV to draw faint silver lines across his face. Softened him, or maybe revealed something softer that had always been there. We didn't speak again. We just watched, scene after scene unfolding like an old memory neither of us had lived, but somehow understood. And in that silence something shifted, not in a dramatic, obvious way. There was no spark, no music, No tension wrapped in longing, just awareness. I sensed more than saw. His glance turned toward me now and then, not watching, but observing, the way an artist might study how light falls on a still life. Quiet, respectful, distant. It was the kind of attention that didn't invade, only invited. Not an invitation to act, but to notice, to reflect. When the film ended, I reached to turn off the TV. As I bent to pick up the blanket that had slipped to the floor, I caught a glimpse of him still looking, his expression unreadable. Not startled, not embarrassed, just still. Present. Open. He didn't avert his eyes, and I didn't feel the need to hide. It was one of those moments so small it might have gone unnoticed, but I felt something settle beneath my ribs, like a thought I hadn't meant to think. I stood, nodded politely, and left the room. My heartbeat wasn't racing, but it wasn't quiet either. Nothing had happened, nothing inappropriate, nothing spoken, not even a touch. And yet something was unfolding, not between us, but within me. A recognition, a reminder that being seen, not in a romantic way, not even a personal way, but being truly seen, can stir parts of ourselves we'd long forgotten still existed. Morning arrived with a hush, the kind of quiet you only get in the woods, where even the wind sounds like it's trying not to wake the trees. I slipped out of bed without waking Daniel. He was still curled beneath the covers, breathing slow, steady, the same rhythm he's always had, reliable, familiar. I wrapped a cardigan around me and padded softly into the kitchen. The cabin felt even smaller in the morning light. Intimate, almost too still. The kettle hissed gently. I reached for mugs. A moment later, I heard light footsteps. Eli entered, hair damp from the shower, dressed simply in a t-shirt and joggers. He looked rested, though his eyes carried that same quiet depth, like he was always listening to something no one else could hear. "Morning," I said softly. "Morning." He walked over to the counter, then paused, held up a small glass jar. "Do you want honey in your tea?" I shook my head automatically, then reconsidered. "Actually, yes. Just a little." He unscrewed the lid and handed it to me. Our fingers touched, briefly, barely, but it was enough. Enough for something to pass between us. Not electricity, not heat, just awareness. And I knew it wasn't one-sided, because he hesitated before pulling his hand back. A pause no longer than a breath, but it was there. The room wasn't cold, and yet I shivered. Not from fear, not from shame, but because I knew something had shifted. Not between us in any visible way, not something that anyone else could see, but I felt it, and I knew he did too. We moved around the kitchen with careful grace, each of us silently adjusting to this new unspoken awareness. It wasn't flirtation, it wasn't confusion, it was something quieter. Something more dangerous perhaps because it wore no name. Sometimes you don't realize the edge is near until your foot nearly slips over it. When Daniel finally came out, rubbing sleep from his eyes, I greeted him with a smile. Nothing in my voice revealed anything unusual. Nothing in my body language betrayed the shift I had felt just moments earlier. But as I set his cup down and sat across from him, I became acutely aware of every distance in the room, those that had closed, and those that had grown quietly wider with time. And I wondered how many stories begin not with a choice, but with a moment too small to resist, and too honest to ignore. The afternoon sun crept through the curtains in long, quiet slants. Daniel had left after lunch to join a small hiking group. Some of his friends had planned to explore the northern trail, the one leading toward the waterfall. He asked if I wanted to join. I said I had a headache. It wasn't a lie, but it wasn't quite the truth either. Sometimes the weight in your chest isn't pain exactly, just too many thoughts waiting to be heard. The cabin was silent. I curled on the bed with the book open but unread. The words on the page blurred into the grain of the wooden walls. Then, a soft knock. I turned my head, heart suddenly alert for no good reason. Eli stood at the door, a glass of lemon water in one hand, 2 cold tablets in the other. "You okay?" he asked. "Just a little dizzy from the sun," I said, offering a faint smile. He nodded. "I'll leave these here." He turned about to go. And then, "Wait," I said. I don't know why. Maybe I didn't want to be alone. Maybe I didn't want the stillness to keep speaking so loudly. Or maybe I didn't want to pretend the question inside me wasn't growing stronger. "Do you want to sit with me for a bit?" He looked at me for a second too long, then walked in slowly, sat on the edge of the bed. Not too close, not too far. I could feel my own breath shorten, not because I was afraid, but because something unsaid had finally stepped into the room. "You looked at me last night," I said quietly. He didn't deny it. He didn't look away. "You're different," he said. "Different how?" "Different from how you tried to appear." The air between us tightened, then softened. I searched his face. "What did you see?" His voice was steady. "I saw someone lonely." I looked down at the blanket across my legs. I nodded, because it was true, and somehow in that truth I felt more known than I had in a long time. He reached toward my hand, then paused, a gesture suspended in choice. I didn't pull away. His fingers brushed mine, softly, quietly, without purpose or promise, just presence. No words followed.
No declarations.
No movement forward or backward, only a touch, and a silence that said everything we couldn't. In that moment, something opened inside me. Not a door, not a desire, just an awareness of being seen, of being held in a moment that asked for nothing, but meant everything. The sky turned the color of soft stone by late afternoon. Daniel called around 6. The signal was patchy, his voice fading in and out through the trees. "They'd taken a wrong turn," he said. The group would be staying overnight at a small guest lodge on the edge of the forest trail. "Don't worry," he added. "We'll be back by noon tomorrow." And just like that, the evening was mine. I didn't feel anxious. I didn't feel sad. What I felt was a kind of space opening around me, as if someone had gently opened a door, not to escape, but to breathe. I cooked something simple, pasta, a little white wine, soft music in the background. The cabin felt warmer than usual, or maybe I was just more aware of the quiet. Eli came downstairs, his hair still damp from a shower, wearing a knit sweater, sleeves pushed casually up to his elbows. Something about that detail, how informal it was, made the moment feel unusually personal. "You cooked," he said, his voice even. "I didn't realize I was hungry until I started boiling the water," I replied. He smiled faintly, and that was all it took to shift the room just slightly. A breath caught between familiarity and something unnamed. We ate across from each other. The table between us felt smaller than it had earlier that morning. The shadows from the pendant light danced slowly on the wall. The wine flushed my cheeks. Not from the alcohol, but from something else I didn't want to name. I reached for a napkin. As I leaned, the neckline of my cotton dress slipped slightly. Not much. Not deliberate, but enough. I didn't adjust it immediately, and in the silence I felt Eli's gaze flicker once, then again. This time not directly, but through the small mirror hanging beside us on the wall. He didn't stare. He didn't linger, but he saw, and I knew he had. I stayed still, not as a provocation, but because sometimes the absence of correction becomes its own quiet admission. For a moment, neither of us moved. The music played on. Outside, the wind pressed gently against the glass. Eli stood first. I expected him to return to the loft. Instead, he walked around the table unhurried. then paused behind me, close, but not too close. "If you want me to go," he said, his voice almost a whisper, "I will." I didn't speak, not out of confusion, but because I didn't yet know which part of me would be speaking. So I said nothing, and still he didn't move forward. He didn't push. He simply placed his hand lightly on my shoulder, not possessive, not demanding, just waiting. I turned, slowly, met his eyes. He looked at me with something like restraint laced in clarity, as if he too understood how delicate the moment was. Then he leaned in and kissed me, softly, as though the kiss itself was a question, not an answer. It wasn't urgent. It wasn't reckless. It was two people in stillness, acknowledging something they hadn't expected but could no longer ignore. My hand touched his chest, just over his heartbeat. It felt steady, real. We didn't go further. We didn't speak. But in that quiet embrace, I understood something had shifted inside me that would not return to where it had been. I couldn't sleep, not because I regretted what had happened, but because I couldn't stop replaying it. Every quiet second, every pause that said more than speech ever could. Eli's kiss wasn't bold. It wasn't a declaration or a step forward into something forbidden. It was a moment, a breath between two people who had been walking quietly beside their own sadness for far too long. When he stepped back, his hand still warm where it had rested gently on my shoulder, he didn't ask for anything more. He didn't linger. He simply nodded and walked upstairs, leaving behind a silence that hummed inside me like the echo of a wave that never broke. I lay in bed on my side, the blanket pulled up to my chin. The door was closed, but I felt the weight of the open question it held behind it. What do we do with the moments that don't ask for action but still change us? Where do we place them? There was no guilt. Not exactly. Because nothing had truly happened, nothing I could name, nothing I could confess, and yet everything felt different. At dawn I got out of bed. The air was cool, the kind that reminded you you're alive and flawed and still figuring things out. I brewed tea, let it steep too long. By the time I reached for it, it had already gone cold. I didn't drink it. I just stood there, one hand resting on the rim of the cup, trying to feel grounded in a body that suddenly didn't know how to forget being seen. When Daniel returned later that afternoon, everything looked the same. He hugged me lightly, habitually, asked how my headache was, told me they'd found the trail in the morning. I smiled, said I felt better. He nodded and disappeared into the bathroom. He didn't notice anything had changed. That evening we had dinner together, the three of us. The table was filled with the usual small talk. Weather, the hike, a film playing later that night. Daniel didn't sense a thing, but I did. Eli did. When I spoke, I kept my voice calm, careful. "I think I'll move back into the guest room," I said, setting my fork down softly. "You can have the loft again, Eli. I need space for my writing." I felt Eli pause just for a second. Daniel didn't notice. He was focused on his phone. "Sure," Eli replied. His tone was light, controlled, but I saw the flicker behind his eyes. Not disappointment, not confusion, just understanding. That night I didn't cry. I didn't ache. What I felt was something closer to clarity, the awareness that some boundaries are not enforced by rules, but by grace. And sometimes the most respectful thing we can do with a feeling is leave it intact, unrushed, unresolved, unacted upon. Upstairs, I lay on my back and stared at the ceiling. Somewhere in the cabin, I could hear Eli moving gently in the loft. We were both awake, but we would not speak. We would not revisit what had passed between us, because sometimes the most sacred part of a connection is letting it go before it becomes something you can't take back. That night I didn't dream. I just lay still, eyes open, breath even, listening. The old wood of the cabin creaked softly with every shift of the wind. Somewhere above me, I heard a drawer open, footsteps crossing the loft floor, a quiet door clicking shut. Eli was awake too, but neither of us sought the other out, because silence, when held by two people with care, can be more respectful than words. If this were a different kind of story, maybe something would have happened. Maybe there'd be a spark, a surrender, a consequence. But this isn't that kind of story, and I'm not that kind of woman, not anymore. I've lived long enough to know that connection isn't always meant to lead somewhere. Sometimes it's meant to teach you where you stand. The next morning, the cabin was filled with sunlight and the scent of brewing coffee. I stood in the kitchen, watching the light slip across the floor like it had a secret to keep. Daniel came in, kissed my cheek. Routine. Simple. I smiled. Eli entered a moment later. Dressed, alert, calm. He offered me a quiet nod. I returned it with one of my own, and that was enough. We had breakfast like any other family. Daniel talked about the trail and the forest sounds at night. Eli asked about train schedules and studio deadlines. No one mentioned the evening before, but I felt it. How we were each quietly protecting something, not hiding it, just choosing to keep it intact. Untouched. After breakfast, I stepped outside with my tea. The balcony overlooked the sloping hill below the cabin. I let the steam rise into the crisp air, eyes unfocused. I wasn't thinking about Eli, not anymore. I was thinking about Daniel and me, and how long we had gone without reaching for each other, really reaching. I wasn't angry, just aware that something precious had slipped through the cracks of our routine, not because either of us had betrayed anything, but because we hadn't been paying attention. That afternoon, I pulled out a notebook, not to write a story, not even to reflect, but to start asking better questions. Who am I becoming? What kind of connection do I want to build and protect? And most importantly, where do I draw the line between being wanted and being whole? Later, as we packed for departure, I walked past Eli in the hallway. We didn't stop, but as I turned the corner, I heard him say softly without turning back, "Thank you." I didn't reply, but I felt it. The line had been drawn, not in shame, not in fear, but in grace. We left the cabin early. The road curved through hills and trees still damp from the night's rain. Daniel drove. I sat beside him, quietly sipping tea from a travel mug. Eli was in the back seat, head leaned against the window, earphones in. None of us spoke much, but silence can mean many things, and this time it felt like closure. Just before we reached the train station, I turned slightly in my seat. "Good luck with your final project," I said over my shoulder. Eli looked up, met my eyes. "Thanks," he replied. There was no double meaning in his voice, just a softness, and something like respect. After we dropped him off, Daniel and I continued toward the city. The hum of the car filled the space between us. Eventually, he reached for my hand across the console. I let him hold it. It felt different. Not forced, not habit, but intentional. That night back home, I unpacked slowly. My clothes smelled faintly of cedar and wood smoke. I folded them neatly, placing them into drawers with care. When I reached the bottom of the suitcase, I found the small notebook I had taken with me, pages mostly blank, except for one sentence I had scribbled in soft pencil. "What defines us is not what we feel, but what we choose to do with it." In the days that followed, life resumed, but something inside me had changed. Not because of what happened, but because of what didn't. One evening, I walked into the study where Daniel was reading. "I've been thinking," I said, leaning against the doorframe. He looked up. "I don't want us to drift," I continued. "We've spent too much time being polite. I want to know what's still alive between us. I want us to look again." His expression shifted, surprised, unsure but open. "I'd like that," he said. Later, as we washed dishes side by side, I found myself watching the way his hands moved, the quiet way he turned the plates under the water, the small details I used to notice before time softened them into background. Maybe love doesn't disappear. Maybe it just waits for us to notice it again. As for Eli, I haven't seen him since that morning at the train station, but I think of him sometimes, not with longing, with gratitude, for reminding me that being seen isn't about temptation, it's about recognition, and that some moments come to wake us up, not to be acted on, but to be understood, honored, and then released. This story isn't about a mistake, it's about a choice. And sometimes the most powerful choices we make are the ones that never need to be explained. Weeks passed, quietly, almost imperceptibly, the kind of passage of time where nothing dramatic happens, but you still know deep down that something inside you has shifted for good. Daniel and I settled back into the rhythm of shared routines, coffee in the morning, grocery lists on the fridge, brief kisses before one of us left the house. Nothing had changed between us, but I had, and because I had, the sameness around me no longer felt invisible. It felt like something I had to choose now, consciously, to stay, to rebuild, to be present. I didn't think of Eli every day, but when I did, it wasn't with longing. It was with stillness. The kind of remembrance that doesn't ache, but holds its breath in respect for what was almost and never meant to be. One Thursday afternoon, a small envelope arrived in the mail. No return name. No note. Inside was a sketch. A woman standing at a balcony, her back turned to the viewer, shoulders relaxed, hair caught mid-motion in the wind. There was something hauntingly still about the drawing. She wasn't sad. She wasn't waiting. She was simply there, rooted in her own moment. I knew it was from him, and I knew exactly what it meant. He had seen me that night, not as a wife, not as a mother figure, not even as someone he desired. He had seen me as a woman caught in the quiet space between loyalty and loneliness. And that sketch, it wasn't a message. It was a mirror. A way of saying, I remember too, and I understood. I placed it in a drawer, not to hide it, but to keep it safe, not as a secret, but as a memory. There are some silences that don't haunt you. They guide you. They remind you that the heart is vast, capable of many feelings at once, without needing to act on all of them. I didn't tell Daniel about the sketch, not because I was hiding, but because it belonged to a part of me that was now quiet, complete. We were finding our way again slowly, not back to what we had been, but forward into what we still might become. Sometimes the things that shape us most are the ones that never fully unfold. They arrive, touch something tender, and leave us changed without taking anything with them. I once read that not every emotion asks to be answered. Some are simply meant to be noticed, gently acknowledged, then allowed to pass through us like weather. I think of that often now, because some mornings, while brushing my hair or boiling water for tea, a memory surfaces of a silence shared, a glance that lingered, a warmth that never crossed into flame, and I let it come, not to relive it, but to remember that I am the one who chose what to do with it. Daniel and I are learning each other again, not in big cinematic ways, not through second honeymoons or grand confessions, but in smaller, quieter gestures. He's more present at the table. He asks deeper questions now, not just about my schedule, but about my thoughts, my moods, my pauses. And I've started answering them honestly, even when the answer is, I'm not sure. We're not healed, but we're healing. And maybe that's more real than anything we had in the beginning, when everything was polished, rehearsed, and easy. Now we sit in the truth of each other. It's not always romantic, but it is real, and that matters more. One evening, I found myself alone on the balcony again. The The air was colder than I expected. I wrapped my sweater around me and stood exactly as I had that night at the cabin, and for a moment I thought of the sketch again, of Eli, of that version of myself captured in pencil, still whole, suspended between longing and restraint. She is still part of me, but she doesn't define me. She was a reminder, a threshold I stood before and chose not to cross. We all carry stories no one else sees, conversations that never left our lips, questions we never asked out loud, feelings we folded into the quiet of our own chest and wore like invisible silk. What matters is how gently we hold them, not as regrets, but as reminders of who we were when no one else was watching. Sometimes love is staying, sometimes it's letting go, and sometimes it's learning how to hold space for both. Disclaimer: this story is a fictional narrative created for emotional exploration and reflective storytelling. It does not depict real people or events. The content is intended for mature audiences interested in nuanced perspectives on relationships, identity, and personal growth. No boundaries were crossed, and all interactions remain within respectful, emotionally safe contexts. Viewer discretion is advised.